Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And so to the main story of the week. The good news is that Nissan, Britain's biggest car maker, is going to plough more money into its Sunderland plant despite the uncertainties after the Brexit vote. And this has happened after private promises from the government. The more unsettling thing is that we have absolutely no idea what those promises were. Greg Clark did the deal and the business secretary joins me.
Thank you for having me here.
Very nice to talk to you. Now, you have said that you're not going to allow British car manufacturing to be disadvantaged in the future. Can we agree that if they had to pay tariffs on their exports, that would disadvantage Nissan and the other companies?
Well, can I first of all just endorse what you say? This is a big moment, not just for Nissan, but for the people of Sunderland.
Surely.
Talking to one of your colleagues this morning, they know people there, but for the country. And it's my job to provide the assurances to Nissan and to other investors that Britain is going to continue to be a great place to invest in the future. I was able to do that, and this was the results that we saw announced this week.
Just coming back to my question then, would tariffs disadvantage Nissan?
Of course, if there were tariffs in a market which is very international, there's a lot of trade from the continent of Europe to the UK, and vice versa. The supply chain is integrated. So one of the assurances that I was able to give is that our intention, our negotiating remit when it comes to the discussions with our European partners is to have a constructive and civilised dialogue to look for the common interest here. It's no more in the interest.
Mean no tariffs.
Well, it's in no more of the interest of for there to be tariff barriers to the continent and vice versa. So what I said is that our objective would be to ensure that we have continued access to the markets in Europe and vice versa, without tariffs and without bureaucratic impediments, and that was how we'll approach those negotiations.
This is absolutely crucial and sheds a bit more light on what the government's position is than we knew before, because it's very, very important to all British manufacturing that they get the minimum tariffs or no tariffs at all, and as you say, no bureaucratic impediments. Yeah. Do you think this can be negotiated?
Yeah, the reason that I was able to give that confidence and that assurance is that this is good negotiations are about finding the common ground between both sides to the negotiation, and for the European. Continental European car manufacturers, they export a lot to us, we export a lot to them, components go backwards and forwards. So this is a good example of how I think if you conduct the negotiations in a serious, constructive and civilised way, actually there is a lot in common that we can establish, and that I was able to reassure Nissan and other manufacturers that is the way that we are going to approach it.
In clear terms, you went to Tokyo, you went to Japan. Were you able to assure Nissan at that point that there were most unlikely to be tariffs that they would face in the future?
Well, obviously the negotiations haven't started, sure. So what I was able to convey very clearly is what our demeanour would be in those negotiations. Obviously they haven't started, let alone ended, and everyone's adult enough to know that. But I think it is important, and it's been my experience that actually talking to people face to face and communicating the seriousness of your intent is important to any discussion, any negotiation. That was what I was able to lay out.
Let's just remind ourselves of what Carlos Ghosn, who's the head of Nissan, said just before all this happened. He said, if I need to make an investment in the next few months and I can't wait until the end of Brexit, then I have to make a deal with the UK government. And he says that would involve compensation if I face tariffs and so forth. How worried were you at the beginning of this process that Nissan might just pull the plug?
Well, it was a huge decision. Sunderland is our biggest car manufacturing plant. It is a huge beacon of excellence around the world. And these big investment decisions come every 10 or 15 years. So there was a huge amount riding on
the government
so
as well.
Exactly. So my job as business secretary, if we were sitting here today discussing how we'd let it slip through our fingers and actually we were not going to get the future of Sunderland secured, you quite rightly would feel that I hadn't been active enough. So my determination was to go all out to provide the confidence that a long-term investor needs, that Britain will be the go-to place for manufacturing cars.
So that's why you went to see Nissan. They wanted this in writing. Did you write the letter yourself?
There have been, as you might imagine, through this, a lot of both discussions and communications by letter. But
does it say Greg Clark at the bottom?
I've written to Mr. Gone and to other people that set out the reassurances that we've just been talking about.
You've been very, very clear that reassurances does not mean extra public money. Can I just press you a little bit on
Yes, of
that?
course.
Clearly, if you were going to say to Nissan or any other car maker, if you face tariffs, we will compensate you, that would be against WTO rules. You wouldn't be allowed to do it. It would be illegal.
Yes, it's as you said earlier. This is why I think you need to set out your negotiating principle, the way that you do it, but also to make a commitment, not to provide compensation, because for the reason that you say that's not possible, but to have a determination to make sure that this very important sector remains competitive. Let me say
Sorry,
that's...
can I just say,
Yes.
what about other forms of financial remuneration? What about aiding them in training workers, buying land, better roads, whatever they might need? In other words, soft aid for Nissan. Have you offered them that?
Well, I wouldn't call it soft because it's quite
Right.
rigorous, the process
Hard
for this.
cash.
But yes, let me describe that. So in terms of things to do with Brexit, for all the reasons you say, it's simply not possible to as it were, compensate for any future risk. So the intention of the government in keeping the sector competitive was important. Now, it is the case in the motor industry that we've had a very long track record of investment in skills, in innovation, in research and development in the sector. But these things are independently reviewed. You can't guarantee them. They are competitively...
But they can expect a bit more help in this regard.
Well, I hope that they will succeed. They have to apply as other companies, in fact, almost every company in the motor sector would do. That's been one of the secrets of our success in recent years. But everything needs to be reviewed independently. They're competitive. But we want to see the whole industry prosper.
There are, as you know, certain suspicions about this deal, not least from Nissan's competitors. Why don't you just publish the letter? Can you publish the letter?
Well, I can tell you exactly what it said. We've covered some of it. Shall I?
Yes,
go through it?
just run us through what the letter says.
So 4 key points. 3 of them on the industry generally, and the 4th about Brexit. So the first is what we talked about. Are we going to continue our approach with the sector to have competitive and independently assessed funds available to all companies for training and skills and all the rest of it. And as Sir Michael Wilshaw was saying, that's very important to make sure the workforce does have those skills. So that's the first one. The second one is about place. One of the things that we've made a commitment to over recent years is whether in Sunderland or whether in the West Midlands, that we regenerate sites so that the supply chain, the small and medium-sized businesses that supply the majors. In the past, up to now, many of them have been overseas. So there is a joint initiative with the industry
to bring them home.
And that, again, we confirm that continues to be our ambition.
Number 3.
The third is a particularly exciting one, which is the future of the automotive sector. We have huge strengths in science and research in this country, as you know. And the motor industry is changing very rapidly. Electric vehicles, for example.
Yes, Dyson are building an electric car and so forth.
Absolutely. So what Nissan and others wanted to know is, are we committed to being at the leading edge of research and development? And we are. Actually, the creation of my department that brings energy and industry together is a very good example of how you can get our leadership in renewable energy paired with our leadership in automotive and put that forward.
And so finally we come to Brexit itself.
Exactly.
And the essence is we will try to achieve tariff-free trade for you. Basically is what you're saying, yes?
So there are 2 components to that. Let me try to set it out for completeness. So the first is to be very clear about what we want from the negotiations, which is to find that common ground between our European friends and neighbours and ourselves. And whatever happens, given that we can't know the outcome, we can't know the end, that we have through our industrial strategy, which is very important to the Japanese in particular, who have long had one, that we make a commitment to keep competitive the United Kingdom industry. They were the assurances that gave confidence, I'm delighted to say, that's allowed these jobs to be safeguarded and enhanced.
And again, for clarity, John McDonnell has said that he wants the assurances that you have given to Nissan to be extended to all of the other British manufacturers. Well, can you do that?
Indeed. Well, as I said, I mean, a lot of these apply to the industry generally.
So it's not
confirming.
General, okay.
No, it's not general. And of course, I mean, if you think about an industrial strategy that we're developing, you need to build on your strengths.
Okay.
The automotive sector is one of our great strengths in this country. So, of course, part of our strategy, how could it be any otherwise, is to keep it
competitive. There's a lot more meat here than I was expecting, but I'm going to press you even further.
Glad
because
to provide it.
If we're talking about a customs-free deal, if we can get one for manufacturing and so forth, we have also said that we're going to take back control over migration, which means that we can't be part of the Norway-style economic deal. We would have to have what is called a customs union, as Turkey and other countries have. Is that by and large where we're heading, do you think?
Well, that is taking us beyond the territory that I was discussing with Nissan, and at the moment the government...
But it's the logical conclusion of it.
Well, what I would say to that, Andrew, is that my discussion, not just with Nissan, but with other companies in this country and investors in it, I think it's important to understand what they want from our negotiation, what's going to be the interests of the British economy. That's what we're doing. I'm spending a lot of time getting from them what they need. We haven't made decisions yet on what that crystallises in terms of what we want to achieve.
So if we want to get some deal that's something like a customs union, whatever we call it, that's very good for manufacturing, but it doesn't deal with the service sector, which is still the majority of our economy. What's the future, do you think, for banks and passporting? Because that's the other really big, and again, huge numbers of jobs.
It is indeed, and that's exactly why it seems to me you need to take it in a considered and sober way to make sure that you consider all of the different sectors. Financial services is hugely important. It was ironic that I think John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, was saying that we were completely focused on financial services on the day that we announced, or Nissan announced, their investment.
So alongside any kind of customs union deal, you would need some kind of deal to help the financial services industry.
Part of our negotiation has to be to look right across the board at our industries. And by industry, I don't mean just manufacturing, important as that is, the service sector as well, the creative industry is very important. My view is that we need to approach this in a serious and sober way, get from them what they need, and then go into what is...
If I may, one very final question, we're running out of time. If business is looking for certainty, then surely it's very important that Mark Carney stays for his full term as Governor of the Bank of England.
Well, I think Mark Carney has done a tremendous job, a fantastic job during his tenure there. It's clearly a decision for him, but I...
You hope he carries on.
I was the Financial Secretary to the Treasury when he was appointed, and I think it was a brilliant appointment.
Mr. Clark, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Now,
so I'm delighted now to be joined by Keir Starmer, former Director of Public Prosecutions, now Mr. Brexit for Labour. I'm going to start with a really simple question.
Of all the labels.
I'm now going to start with an incredibly simple question for you. What is Labour's position on Brexit and immigration, for example?
Very straightforward. We accept and respect the result. We think there should be a real grip about the plans, but we're clear...
But control of immigration, because, you know, the party leader's position, Jeremy Corbyn's position, has been very ambiguous on this.
Just let me be clear. Economy and jobs come first, as far as we're concerned.
Above control of immigration?
I think the mistake the Prime Minister has made is to make control of immigration the #1 priority and to relegate the economy to a second-rank issue. That is quite extraordinary.
So for you, access to the single market trumps control of immigration?
Well, for a Prime Minister of this country, putting peace...
But can I be clear on that? Because I think people out there really do want to know what Labour's position is. Single market or immigration first?
We say fullest possible access to the single market. That is what everybody wants. We accept, let me be clear, we accept that immigration was a big issue in the referendum. We accept there has to be change to the way the freedom of movement rules operate. That's got to be balanced with the best access to the single market. That's what the negotiation should be about, and that should be the starting position of the government.
And including, for example, paying into the budget for access in the way that Norway does?
Well, that has to be negotiated, but we need a stated position, and it is fullest possible access to the single market, the closest we can get to membership. We're members at the moment because we're obviously EU members. We'll lose that membership. So the closest we can get to that, negotiating really hard. Of course there's got to be change to freedom of movement. That's got to be part of the negotiations. The government should aim high, and it should put economy and jobs first.
So there is clear, what you might call red water here between you and the Tories. Now, on Nissan, you presumably welcome the Prime Minister's intervention to keep them here.
I think it's really good news that Nissan have made the decision they have. It's really good news for the North East. Not only the jobs directly at Nissan, but of course all the many other jobs that go with it. So that's good news. We must be clear about that and unequivocal about that. But what we don't know is what caused Nissan to make that decision, because only 3 weeks ago Nissan were clear. They said we want to trade on the same terms, with the same fluidity, that's how they put it, or we want compensation. Fast forward, 3 weeks later, they're happy with the deal, and they say they've got an assurance from the government. And there's been an exchange of letters. Now, we need to know what's in that exchange of letters, because something's been said to Nissan that's made them satisfied and assured that they can invest in the way they're going to invest. There is a serious point here, because we've been pressing the government to say, what's your strategy? What are the terms on which you're entering the negotiation? And they won't tell us. What's your plan? They won't tell us. They've told Nissan part of the plan, and it's in a letter. So the sooner we see that letter, the better.
So just to be clear, your issue about Nissan is not whether money has been promised to Nissan to compensate them for possible tariffs. It's that you think they've been shown the roadmap to Brexit.
Well, they've been shown something. Now, the government says no money has been promised, and we take that at face value.
Do you take that at face value?
Well, when government ministers are saying no, there's no promise of money, I mean, pretty foolhardy on their part, because whatever the deal is going to come out in the long run.
But what if the deal was something like, you know, we guarantee to provide subsidies to investment in Britain in the future?
I think it'll be something to do with the overall arrangements, making it no less competitive for Nissan, and that means they are talking about ways of making it easy to deal. What's really interesting is...
So what do you think that means?
All businesses, Nissan and others, are also... Their basic message to the government is really clear. We want to trade on the same terms. So they don't want customs, tariffs, procedures, standardisation, all the rest of it.
But how can the government promise no tariffs?
Well, they can promise that if there is tariffs, they'll be offset in some other way. I don't know.
But that is a financial commitment, then?
I don't know.
So that would imply that you think...
there may be a financial element to it, I accept that. They say no money is changing hands. But this, I mean, I don't know. We need to know. And I'm going to try and raise this in Parliament tomorrow, because something's been said. It's good Nissan are investing, of course it's good. But there are other businesses up and down the country of every size.
So you're posing an urgent question, are you?
Well, I'm going to try and raise it tomorrow. It's obviously for the Speaker to decide whether it can be raised. But, you know, it's not just this deal that we need to know about. It's what happens for the other businesses. Businesses are talking to me all the time, and they're very worried about what happens to them. They want to trade on the same terms. And if there's a deal that's good enough for Nissan, they're saying, and it's quite understandable, well, we want broadly the same deal for us.
But what about tying the Prime Minister's hands, which is plainly a risk if she gives away too much of her negotiating position to you and other MPs?
Well, of course, the detailed negotiating position can't be disclosed, and it will evolve over the 2 years. The starting position won't be the end position. But the broad strategic aims need to be known. And we just need to remember that there was nothing on the ballot on the 23rd of June about the terms of exit. There was nothing in the Conservative Party manifesto. And Theresa May said nothing about it when she became Prime Minister. So at the moment, there's no accountability for what is going to be the biggest set of decisions for many, many years. The basic... and I think there's now a sort of growing feeling that the basic terms have to be put before Parliament, so that we can all see. And
what about the position of your old friend Tony Blair, who says that if it's a hard Brexit, there should be a second vote?
Well, Tony Blair is saying that there ought to be something at the end of the process. I've taken a different approach, which is to say...
so you disagree with him? You don't think there should be a second referendum or a second vote of the people?
There must be a vote in Parliament on the final deal. I'm absolutely clear about that. But
that won't be for 2.5 years.
But for me, what's more important is there must be a vote on the opening terms.
Yeah.
Because... the final deal, I think, may put us all in a difficult position, because if it's nearly the end of the negotiation, it'll be basically saying to Parliament, you either vote for this deal, however good or bad it is, or there's no deal, which is even worse. So
but just very briefly,
that isn't enough.
But can I just be clear? Because people I think, do want to know about this. Blair is wrong. There shouldn't be a second vote.
We've
Is that
had
what
a
you're saying?
referendum. We shouldn't have another referendum on the same issue. What is really important?
But a referendum on the terms
I'm not
of
talking
access
about.
to
I'm
the
talking
second...
about a vote in Parliament.
I know you're not.
I'm talking about.
I know you're. You're absolutely not
Tony
talking
Blair
about
is very
a second...
good at explaining and accounting for himself, and I'm not going to become responsible for his position. I'm saying my position is a vote on the basic terms. That's really important. A vote at the end, but the vote at the end is no substitute for grip at the beginning.
Keir Starmer failed to escape from the holding cell and is still with us. But first, Allegra.
Well, just then, Keir Starmer asked for more detail from the government about what they've actually promised Nissan. Earlier this morning, Greg Clark, the Minister of the moment, who supposedly did this deal, he did an interview, and Patrick Winter, my old boss at The Guardian, has summarised it helpfully for us, and perhaps for Keir Starmer. It's a 4-part package. It's available to auto sector training, this is very jolly sounding, regional relocation grants, research aid, and seeking no tariff barriers. So I suppose, in a nutshell, there will be no tariffs, so there'll be no money to need to compensate. But then elsewhere, other people were a bit concerned that is this the right tweet? I'm not sure. Labour isn't that bothered about the public wanting more control over immigration. Maybe, Robert, you could go back over that. But just to check back into our Peston on Sunday poll, who's the best place to handle these Brexit negotiations, this is pretty painful viewing for the Labour Party. So massively, Theresa May in the lead, but then just 10%, 1 in 10 of us all think that Keir Starmer's boss, Jeremy Corbyn, is the best place to handle our leaving of Brussels. Now, when we asked who they thought had a credible plan for how the country should be run, of all voters, just 18% thought Jeremy Corbyn had a credible plan. And then look at this. In some ways, this is even more interesting. These are people who voted for Labour in 2015, and even of them, only 33% thought that Corbyn had a plan. Robert.
Thanks, Allegra. We've just seen a little bit more detail from Greg Clark about what he promised Nissan, and it does look like money. I mean, he's basically saying the auto industry is going to be showered with subsidies.
Well, I noticed the word subsidy there, and I noticed what he said about tariffs. And what's extraordinary is here we are, 10:15 on a Sunday morning, and we're learning more about the government's plan
From Andrew Marr, as it
than
were.
they've ever disclosed to Parliament. I mean, they clearly have a plan is emerging, a bit chaotically, bit by bit, but it is emerging. And Nissan's been told more about it than we have in Parliament. So the government's got to come clean, I think, this week and put the terms before Parliament. Because to learn of this in response to an interview this morning is the wrong way to prepare for these negotiations.
Now, on the issue of you and Labour, you resigned in June because you didn't think Corbyn is electable. Do you now think he is electable?
Well, obviously what followed from that was a leadership election. Jeremy Corbyn won that leadership election. And we now need to all pull together because before we even get to another election, we've got the issue of Brexit to deal with. What happens in the next 2 or 3 years
So,
is hugely
so just to be clear,
important.
you don't, because Jeremy Corbyn thinks there could be a snap election next year. It sounds as though you disagree with
Well, I don't know. I mean, I vary. Sometimes I think it might happen. Sometimes I don't. I think it won't. I don't know. I think it's possible. But the likelihood is it'll be 2020. But the point I'm really making is this, that it's very important for the Labour Party, as the opposition, to hold the government to account on issues such as Brexit right here, right now. And that's what I'm trying to do, working with Jeremy, with the whole of the Labour Party.
But why, I'm still unclear why you changed your mind. And to use that awful phrase, with all due respect, you didn't say that you thought Corbyn could win an election.
If you read carefully what I was most concerned about, it was that Labour needed to be much stronger on the EU. I was very concerned about whether we were strong enough and whether we were going to be strong enough in the coming years, which is so important. Now,
people will see this as you saying that Jeremy can't win an election. That's how people will interpret what you're saying now.
I'm not saying that in the slightest.
You are saying
I'm not saying that in the slightest. I'm saying that the task in hand is Brexit. That's what I'm concentrating on. Jeremy is the leader of the Labour Party, and I'm supporting him. That's absolutely clear.
Now, you had a bit of time as Director of Public Prosecutions. You might have noticed that The Sun had a bit of a pop at you last week over Eldon, where there have been no successful prosecutions, but millions of taxpayers' money spent. They say you should apologise for Operation Eldon, which was that investigation into alleged bribes paid by journalists.
Well, most of the prosecutions under Eldon took place after I ceased to be the Director of Public Prosecution, so it wouldn't
you're
be
saying you
for
wouldn't
me
have,
really to,
you wouldn't
to
have
deal
made
with.
those decisions?
And I obviously have not had anything to do with those cases for 3 years now, so I'm not in a position to comment one way or the other. It is clear that whilst the public officials involved have broadly been convicted, the journalists have not been. And I do think we need to just reflect on that and look at the whole way that the framework of the law is set out, because now we've come to the end of the process. But I'm not the Director of Public Prosecutions. I didn't handle those cases, and it's really not for me to comment on them.
And just finally, to pick up on one thing that Allegra mentioned, on immigration, it's quite clear from what you said that access to the single market is Labour's priority over immigration. Do you think the public mood on immigration can be shifted?
Let me be clear on immigration. What we've said and what I accept is that it is a real issue. I was handling immigration for the Labour Party for the early part of this year, and one of the problems for Labour is we've not been seen to be listening on immigration. We've got to do that. We've got to be prepared to adjust our situation, and I think the negotiation should involve negotiating change in the way the freedom of movement rules operate in this country. That ought to be part of the negotiation, so we're clear about that. What we want is the best possible outcome, bearing in mind that, plus the economy and jobs.
Great. Keir Starmer, many, many thanks. Let's see what Nadine Dorries and Liz Kendall made of that. I mean, Nadine, I certainly came away from that absolutely clear that for Labour, and this is, I think, a big difference with Theresa May, is much more focused on access to the single market over control of immigration. Is that how you read that? And how do you think that'll play out there with the wider country?
You know, I think the main point is this, that people like Keir and other Remainers always start their interviews and their commentary with, of course, we accept the result of the British people, and then go on to explain further how they would like to hinder what is only one position that the British people have taken, and that is that we are going to exit the EU. Now, there are many areas...
So why... Sorry, hang on a second. Why is spelling out what he thinks exit means, in a sense, hindering the decision?
Well, in this interview, Keir has spelled out, probably more clearly than he ever has before, to you what he thinks. It's a much more ameliorated position, actually, I think. But in the House of Commons, it's quite clear there are many people on the Remain side who, from Tony Blair, who would like to see, my name isn't in the Commons, who would like to see another referendum, to those who would like to actually do everything they can to hinder the process towards exiting the European Union. Now, we have to, you know, there are many areas that the government cannot reveal its hand. We have the customs union, which, as you know, is far more complex, has countries in it which aren't even in the EU.
Sure.
That needs to be discussed. There are tariffs. There is access to the single market. There is immigration. It is incredibly complex. And you are not going to see information coming from the government until they can be absolutely clear and present a case to the British people. And that will frustrate people like Keir, and sorry, Liz, but that's the way it's going to be.
Liz, you would presumably agree with pretty much everything that Keir
Yeah, absolutely. You know,
said.
there's a mandate for Brexit, but there's no mandate for the terms. And you can't just switch off democracy. We are rightly going to ask questions of the government.
But can I just, are you pleased? I doubt that Jeremy Corbyn would ask you to serve on his front bench, but you're quite a long way from the front bench. Are you pleased that somebody like Keir is working with Jeremy?
I am very pleased that Keir is setting out that, you know, we need to think about the national economic interest as well as immigration. I think you need to look at the two together. We shouldn't be saying controlling immigration is more important than jobs. He's right to say it's brilliant news for Nissan, but other industries like aerospace, agriculture and our crucial financial services want to know what the government's terms on Brexit are going to be.
And he's also right to say... Nissan, sorry, Ford came out and said exactly the same thing. They've now...
Actually, the Ford statement was a little bit less clear, actually. But back to Allegra, who's got to think a little bit more on Brexit.
Yeah, a session on the Brexit game. So this was the week when the wheels didn't come off Brexit. Car manufacturers Nissan announced they'd stay, and the GDP figures G'd people up. And just look at this. This is a graph from Sky's economics editor, and he is showing us GDP figures over the last forever. This is since 2010. And he's saying, and he's right, you can't really spot the referendum, which is up here, because the GDP figures come out this week, and they're not too bad. The economy is still bearing up, except, have a look at this next graph, and you can see in here that whilst it's great that car manufacturing is getting something of a boom, but nonetheless it's 3% of our exports compared to up here. I love this telestrating thing. Up here you have 15% business services, aka the banks. It's a rare and healthy example of the UK's north being taken care of ahead of the southeast, but still it's the deal for the banks and up here that's going to prove the most critical. Roberts.
So, I'm here with Nadine and Liz. You were saying that broadly you agree with Keir's position. The Prime Minister is absolutely of a view that people voted for control of immigration first and everything else, follows from that. Is there a risk that Labour loses, those who agree with the Prime Minister, let's say to UKIP, which, obviously is a bit of a mess at the moment, but nonetheless is posing a challenge in many constituencies, and by being still a bit equivocal on Europe in some ways, quite a lot of votes for the Lib Dems who are much clearer on all of this. Is the Labour's position sustainable?
I tell you what I think the risk is that the hardline Brexiteers who want a low-tax, deregulated offshore haven, which sees Britain competing with the rest of the world simply by undermining employment rights and wages. That is the wrong vision for Britain, and it will hit the ordinary working class people that Theresa May says she wants to defend. That is the real risk, and that's why it's absolutely right that Keir and the front bench team are holding the government to account on that, whilst rightly saying that we have to negotiate changes to freedom of movement. We have to look at those two issues together and not do what Theresa May has done, which is to put immigration over and above our national economic interest and jobs.
But did you see those poll figures? People agree with Theresa May. The majority of people agree with her position on putting immigration first. The further north you go in the country, into Labour heartlands, at the time of the referendum, immigration became more and more of the issue. And I think she is absolutely clear, we're all clear, immigration actually drove the result in Brexit, and therefore it should be one of the main considerations, along with access to the single
Nadine,
market.
can I, on the issue of the moment, which is Nissan, now it does look as though the government has promised a fairly generous package of support to the motor industry. Now this, frankly, to many people, will look like old Labour stuff, not a Tory approach to industrial policy. Are you at all concerned about that kind of interventionism and basically throwing money at a problem?
Well, I think it's an industrial strategy. I think what needs to be decided are the industries which benefit our economy and our jobs most. And I think that's something that we will see come out as we negotiate towards access to the single market. There will have to be terms and conditions. There will have to be a strategy in place which benefits the UK and benefits UK jobs. And Liz, it isn't the case that Brexit is going to damage jobs or make people worse off, because in my own constituency, I've done a tour of 16 businesses since Brexit, and they are all booming, particularly those who export, because they're paying more for inward goods but getting more on export at the moment and are actually doing very well.
And the European Union and Canada are formally signing a long-delayed trade deal as we speak. Yes, staying with that, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has arrived in Brussels to sign that Canada-EU trade deal after about 7 years of negotiations. It's been, I'm sure you've been following, a stop-start process and could be an ominous sign, perhaps, for a post-Brexit Britain trying to forge its own trading links with Europe. The small matter of the Walloons to get past on that one. Well, to talk about that and some of the week's biggest stories, I'm joined by a panel of top political journalists. Tom Peck, parliamentary sketch writer with The Independent, Lucy Fisher, senior political correspondent with The Times, and Kate Devlin, Westminster correspondent with The Herald. Very good morning to you all. The camera lighted on you there, Kate. Take us through, your intimate knowledge of this EU-Canada trade deal. It is... It seems it's a long process, but Justin Trudeau has arrived. They've smoothed over the diplomatic problems anyway.
They have, and to be fair, you know, there was a point, you know, only a couple of days ago where it looked as if this trade deal, as you say, 7 years in the making, could be derailed, and it could be derailed because of very specific national interests. Stop me if this is going to sound slightly familiar, but, you know, it turns out that when you have a union that involves, almost 30 member states, they have differing interests, they have differing national political difficulties that they have to deal with. And one of the issues was, indeed, the internal workings of Belgian politics.
Yeah, indeed, and those regional parliaments in Belgium and other places as well. So, Lucy, I mean, what's your take? Because both sides in the UK on Brexit and Remain seem to be taking something out of this. Some say, well, we'd be much quicker. If we had to do a deal with Canada, we'd be much quicker if we managed to negotiate on our own. But of course, when it comes to dealing with the EU, then we've got the 27 plus to deal with.
We've got the 27 plus to deal with, and of course these small regional states. There's 38 assemblies and regional parliaments that still have yet to ratify CETA. So this is all only provisional today, the agreement that's being signed. So of course, yes, Brexiteers are sort of saying, well, you know, we already have all the regulations in place. Our deal could be much quicker. Of course, Liam Fox, International Trade Secretary, earlier this week said, called on EU leaders to start talks to make that trade deal while in parallel the Article 50 divorce proceedings are going on. I think that looks very optimistic. Meanwhile, many Remainers are sort of saying, well, look, you know, the timeline, 7 years, that's what we're going to face. You know, the obstacles, the national interest, you talked about, Kate, those are the obstacles we're going to face.
I mean, that's the point, isn't it? I mean, the crucial deal is with the EU for the UK, and it does look, on the basis of this, looks like it could be tricky.
Oh, exactly, yeah. People are suggesting that this deal can therefore be a template for Britain, but it's essentially taken 7 years for Canada to organise, to be measured up for its wedding dress with the EU. And then there is some suggestion that the UK can just put this wedding dress on. Well, our measurements are very, 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 very different, and we're also not getting married, we're getting divorced. And the interesting bit about this deal is not what's in it, it's what's not in it. It's 98% of it's covered, the 2% that's not. They're the contentious bits, and essentially this deal is getting Canadian minerals into Europe's supply chain. Our deal is going to be about financial services. That's extremely hard to work out. It won't be done, and when eventually Britain's financial services are not included in our deal, Parliament will have to, in good conscience, essentially say, well, look, we need financial services in our deal, they're not there. And then you have the popular front pages saying, well, Brexit killed off to save the bankers, and that won't do either. So there isn't really anything instructive for Britain in this.
Well, let's talk about a deal, or perhaps not, that has been done. Lucy, the Nissan deal, or not? I mean, you know, is it just warm words and a pat on the back saying you'll be okay, or do you think there's something more to it? I know your paper's been asking a lot of questions about what's been offered to Nissan.
Well, I think, you know, Greg Clark this morning has sort of repeated what he claims was in that letter to the Nissan chief, that he promised only that the UK would remain competitive. But clearly Nissan regards this promise, these reassurances, as meaning that there aren't going to be punitive tariffs for these 2 new models of cars going to be made in Sunderland. So I think certainly the automotive sector is lining up to be the scene setter of the UK, sort of the government's trade sort of deal with the EU. And Greg Clark today has sort of confirmed that he wants a deal without tariffs and without bureaucratic obstacles.
Because that's the simplest way, isn't it, Kate? I mean, if you think about it, obviously, that if you get an overall deal without tariffs and obstacles, you don't have to have the government as the ultimate backer of this. Because we've also been reading in the papers today, the pharmaceuticals industry, massive exporter, massive investor in the UK, saying, well, you know, if they're getting some of that, if they're getting some of those guarantees, we want them too.
Yes, and that suggests, or certainly seemed to be hinting towards this idea of a customs union. But, you know, in one of the Sunday newspapers today, we have a pro-Brexit group arguing that actually we have to swerve a customs union, because outside of that, we would be able to get twice as many deals if we weren't tied into that kind of deal with the European Union. And so basically what's happening is that the European Union referendum isn't over yet, and the arguments are still happening, but now they're happening, well, they're still happening within government, and there's still this kind of massive battle about what kind of a Brexit and what kind of a Brexit deal we should even be going for.
I mean, Tom, do you get a sense, do you all get a sense that with all this confusion around deal, I mean, this is on a very small issue here, that this might smoke out Theresa May and the Brexit cabinet to give more of a sense of what they are going to be looking for before Article 50 is triggered?
No, they won't tell us what their deal is, because what they're going for, because they'll tell us what they're going for once they've got it and they know what it is, and then they'll say that's what we wanted. And that's the politics of it. And in all of this, politics will trump law, will trump the negotiations.
But the problem is coming back from, you know, all kinds of EU institutions, from major EU member countries, is coming back saying, sorry, you don't understand, UK, you don't understand what the single market is. There is no negotiation on this. If you want to say you want to limit freedom of movement, you can't have this access to the single market.
Yeah, well, that's why it's confusing what Greg Clark has or hasn't promised Nissan, because if he's promised what people are suggesting he's promised, it seems to be against EU law and against WTO law too. Yeah, but Nissan, so the WTO tariff is 10% on cars. You don't need to be a genius to tell Nissan, well, you've saved all that in the crashing pound anyway. That tariff's gone. I mean, it's an 18% reduction in the pound, so that's great news for them.
So throw into this, Kate, I've just been discussing it with Susan Kramer and Lord True there, the Richmond by-election. I mean, could this further complicate things if the Lib Dems were to pull off a spectacular result there?
What the Lib Dems need is to make sure that this by-election is actually about Brexit. We saw an opinion poll last week that suggested that they were really quite far behind, probably because voters are still thinking that this is a Heathrow by-election. And on that, Zach Goldsmith seems to win hands down. So if the Liberal Democrats can spend the next couple of weeks ensuring that it's a Brexit by-election, then yes, absolutely. Theresa May had a majority of 12 on Tuesday morning. With Zach Goldsmith's resignation, that became 11. That is a very difficult position for any government to be in. They're clearly hoping that Zach gets back and will vote with them on the majority of issues. But if the Liberal Democrats get in, it could be a lot more sticky for Theresa May.
And technically, Lucy, Zach Goldsmith's on his own, isn't he? I mean, he's standing as an independent, and technically he's not allowed to use the resources, considerable resources of the Conservative Party in the constituency. And the Lib Dems, still very popular there, still very popular in and around that. They are going to throw, I read somewhere one of the Lib Dems saying, we're not just throwing the kitchen sink at this, we did that in Whitney, we're throwing the house at this.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's going to shape up to be a really interesting contest, and I think Zach Goldsmith may have bitten off more than he can chew. It will be interesting to see if there are sort of backbench Tories, some of his mates in Parliament, that think, you know, we're going to go along and support him anyway on an individual, on a personal basis. That's probably going to, you know, provoke some recriminations from CCHQ and Theresa May. But I think without the real bulk of the party and its resources and its voter ID database system, it's hard to know in such a short amount of time, and with quite a modest sort of spending cap put on the campaign expenditure in the by-election, whether Zach can really match up to the Lib Dems, who are kind of going to get their game on.
And give me your take on some of that point that Kate was making. We can't see yet, but can the Lib Dems make that essential pivot and turn it from, given that they're squeaky clean, so-called, on Heathrow, that they can turn it more into Brexit than Heathrow? Almost it's a given that you're going to oppose the runway at Heathrow.
Yeah, well, you get the answer on that once you get the result. It's a mad by-election. Usually you have a by-election because somebody quits, turns it into an issue to stand against the government against, and this is a double-issue by-election. You will find out whether it's a referendum on Heathrow or a referendum on Brexit the day somebody wins. I don't know what it will prove to anybody. It's mad. There's never really been a two-issue by-election before.
How long is a piece of string? What about Labour in all this, though? I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it? We're sitting here and we haven't mentioned the Labour Party yet. A major by-election, critical by-election. OK, perhaps it was never going to be Labour territory, but, you know, some senior members of the Labour Party saying, well, we shouldn't even stand a candidate because we'll have to throw ourselves in behind the Lib Dems and the Progressive Alliance. Does that show the kind of pickle that Labour's in?
I think it does. They were also suggesting that one reason not to stand would be to help ensure it's a Brexit by-election. Yeah. But they're nowhere in that game. You know, they're not at that race. And they're still struggling from the fallout from how the party itself performed during the EU referendum. And they really haven't been able to move on from that. And it's just a very difficult position for the party to be in. I mean, you know, you've seen Keir Starmer come out and talk about immigration and freedom of movement, but there hasn't been, for the public at least, a real change in how they are how they are seeing Labour now, and it's a real problem for them.
I mean, Lucy, we were reading with interest, weren't we, this week, Tony Blair, former winningest, I hate the word, winningest Labour leader of all time, you know, suggesting he might be trying to make a bit of a comeback on this issue. I mean, are there things going on? It could be triggered by this by-election that could form some kind of realignment around the issue?
Well, I think it's very difficult to see Tony Blair being embraced back into the British political establishment. But I think that is probably right to say that if the Lib Dems win, and as you say, Tom, that meaning that really this is a by-election that has been a sort of a microcosm sort of rerun in miniature second referendum. I think there is something in that idea. And I think in recent weeks it's interesting, after a sort of very shaky start for some of those Remainer MPs, in Parliament they've certainly got their mojo back. They're really trying to grill Theresa May, Anna Soubry, Nicky Morgan, the new awkward squad are really out in force. So I think there is a realignment that's kind of growing momentum.
Let me just throw this last later, John, we're nearly out of time, story we've been discussing today. And Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, he's been taking some heavy flack, of course, directly from the government. We heard it from the mouth of the Prime Minister herself. Do you think he'll stay? And if he didn't, what kind of effect might that have?
Well, his own words were, I've got various personal issues to consider, and obviously he has political ambitions in Canada too. That's not really a secret. The impact of it will obviously depend on the date of his going. And we live in mad times. If he goes in 2018, I don't have a clue what's going to be happening in 2018. Things are changing extremely quickly. But what we are looking to do is convince the world that we are a stable country open for business. And if the independent Bank of England director can't handle what's happening and goes, it's yet another terrible signal to add to the queue.
You know what? We started with Canada. We kind of, in a way, finished with Canada. Very good to see you all. Tom, Lucy, Kate, thank you very much for that.
2 new models of the car to be built are going to secure 7,000 jobs at the car plant in Sunderland, a further 28,000 in the supply chain. The news from Nissan on Thursday was seized on by Leave campaigners as evidence that the British economy is in rude health following June's referendum. This morning, the Business Secretary, Greg Clark, was asked what assurances were given to the Japanese firm's bosses to secure this new investment.
Well, it's in no more of the interest of for there to be tariff barriers to the continent and vice versa. So what I said is that our objective would be to ensure that we have continued access to the markets in Europe and vice versa without tariffs and without bureaucratic impediments. And that is how we'll approach those negotiations.
We're joined now from Newcastle by the Shadow Business Minister, Chio Onwurah. Chio Onwurah, welcome to the programme. Now, Labour's been a bit sceptical about this Nissan decision, so can we begin by making it clear just what a great achievement this is, above all for the workers of Sunderland, who have some of the highest productivity in the world, have never been on strike for 30 years, and produce cars of incredible quality. This is their victory, isn't it?
Andrew, you're absolutely right. And the Nissan plant in Sunderland is amongst the most productive in the world. And the workers of Nissan are amongst the most productive as well. And it's really a victory. It is a victory for them and for the trade unions and the business organisations and everybody who campaigned to make sure that the government couldn't ignore their future. And it's our future. I'm the MP for Newcastle. Indeed. It makes a huge difference to the region. It's our we're a region that still likes to make things that work, and it's a huge part of our advanced manufacturing sector. So it is really something that we welcome, as well as the job security that it brings.
Well, I'm glad we've got that on the record from the Labour Shadow Business Secretary. But your Shadow Chancellor, John MacDonald, he claims the government is ignoring manufacturers and cares only about a small banking elite. In what way is safeguarding 30,000 industrial jobs in the north safeguarding a financial elite?
As I said, we're really pleased that the campaigning by trade unions and the workforce and business organisations meant the government felt they couldn't ignore the Nissan workers. But let's also be clear that we want that kind of job security for all those working in manufacturing and in other sectors as well. And sweetheart deals for one company, no matter how important they are, that does not an industrial strategy make. So
why do you say it's a sweetheart deal? The business secretary, Greg Clark, told the BBC this morning that what was assured to Nissan is an assurance he gives to the whole industrial sector. Why is that a sweetheart deal?
I was really pleased to see that Greg Clark felt he had to say something, and even though it's sad that we're having our industrial strategy, if you like, or our approach to Brexit delivered piecemeal to the media rather than to the British people, to the media and Nissan actually, but he won't publish the letter. So he said he's told us what's in the letter and the reassurances we're giving on training, on science funding and on supporting the supply chain for the automotive sector.
You must be in favour of all of that.
We are in favour of an industrial strategy. So Greg Clark, unlike his predecessor Shadi Javid, Greg Clark can say industry and strategy. He just can't put the two together in a joined-up way.
But
so
what
this is
bit
an
do you disagree
strategy.
with? But I'm still puzzling to find out what it is you disagree with. He has said that the assurances... Well, let me put the question. He has said the assurances he's given to Nissan are available to the car manufacturing sector in general and indeed to industry in general. What's your problem with that?
So, two things, Andrew. Let him publish the letter so that we can see that, you know, rather let him have the transparency he's pretending to offer. But also, we need an industrial strategy that is values-based and mission-orientated and joined up. So he talked about, and I would welcome to hear this, he talked about electric cars and supporting green cars in regard to Nissan. But at the same time, the government has slashed support for other areas of green tech. So what is it? Do we have a green...
But that's not to do with the Nissan deal. The fact is, Labour implied at some stage there were kind of some financial inducements, some secret bribes. That doesn't seem to be the case, at least you're not claiming that anymore. Then you've said it was a sweetheart deal for one company. That turns out not to be the case. Then you want it for all of industry. That does turn out to be the case. What criticism are you left with on this Nissan deal?
I would be really surprised if all that Nissan got was the reassurances that Greg Clark has shared with us, because he didn't answer the question of what happens if we can't get continued tariff-free access to the single market, if we're not within the single market or not within the customs union. And do you really think that a negotiator like Nissan, who are very good at negotiating, they would have accepted making this significant investment without some further reassurances?
So are you claiming that there is some kind of financial bribe involved in this? And if so, what is the evidence?
I would like to see the letter published, and I'd also like to understand what will happen if there are 27 countries which need to agree to the deal that we have for Brexit. How will Nissan remain competitive? How will the automotive industry remain competitive, which Greg Clark said he'd reassured them on that, if we don't get access to that? And we haven't heard anything about that. And it's very well to talk about reassurances given to Nissan, but we need to know where we are going to make sure that this Brexit is in the interests of all workers, not only those who work for Nissan, and not only those who can get the attention of Greg Clark.
Mr. Clark assured Nissan, he tells us, only going what he says, that Britain would remain a competitive place to do business. That was the main assurance he gave them, and he would help with skills and infrastructure and all the rest of it. Now, since you intend to repeal the trade union laws that have made strikes in Britain largely a thing of the past, and you plan to raise corporation tax, you couldn't give Nissan the same assurance, could you?
Well, we could absolutely give Nissan the assurance that we will be, our vision of the future of the UK is based on having a strong manufacturing sector.
Repealing trade union laws?
Sorry?
Repealing trade union laws?
The strength of the manufacturing sector is dependent, as we've seen at Nissan, in having highly skilled, well-paid workers who are contributing towards insignificant productivity. And you don't get that by having an aggressive policy on trade union laws, but also you don't get that simply by slashing corporation tax and not supporting manufacturing investment. Remember that the government, the last government, took away the manufacturing allowances which supported manufacturers and instead slashed corporation tax.
Okay.
And that is their solution. It's a low tax, low skill economy that they want for Brexit.
Okay, Chair Marr, thank you. I'm sorry I had to rush you there, but we have got a lot to get through today, and I'm grateful for you joining us there. I'm still struggling to see what's left of Labour's criticism of this Nissan deal.
Yeah, except for this, and I think this was a valid point that she just made, that what we know for sure is that Greg Clark could say to Nissan, my aim is to get a tariff-free deal. There's no way he can guarantee that.
No, but
none of us know that.
to accept that that was enough.
But no, I don't think that was enough. I think clearly there was a more detailed package involving, as you say, training and other things. I think he's acknowledged this, albeit vaguely. We don't quite know the precise mechanism. What I think is interesting about this is if you reverse what has happened this week, say, you know, at a time when the government says Britain is open for business and it's going to have an industrial strategy, so far a bit vaguely defined, and Nissan hadn't made this commitment. Imagine what would have happened. It's an impossible scenario. And therefore the government, it seems to me, was obliged to make sure that didn't happen.
But let's not forget, Nissan has invested hundreds of millions in the Northeast. It's been a huge success story. When I spoke to workers from Nissan, they were so proud because they went to Japan to teach the Japanese how to be more productive. The idea that Nissan was just going to walk away from this, given its track record, its importance, its biggest plant, wasn't really credible. The government had some bargaining chips in its hand.
Absolutely, of course they weren't going to walk away, and let's not forget that most people, the majority of people in the area that Nissan is based, voted for Brexit. Nissan knows it's in a powerful position on its side because this is a very emotive sector. You know, clearly the government didn't want to have some big showdown, but I just don't think that there's a smoking gun here. You know, the Labour Shadow Minister there really struggled to articulate what exactly she thinks the government is hiding. I think the reassurances that were given were pretty anodyne, really. And what
they were general.
They were anodyne and general, and what Greg Clark was setting out was an objective, and he made the right noises, and Nissan exercised its right to sabre rattle. It does have rather a history of doing that.
The one thing that would now be clear, given Mr. Clark's performance this morning on the BBC, is that if we were to discover some kind of financial incentive directly linked to this investment, not more for skills or more for infrastructure, that's fine. But some direct financial investment, compensation for tariffs, which of course would be illegal under World Trade Organization rules, or what you might call a financial bribe, the Business Secretary's position would be untenable.
Yes, he'd be in a very difficult position indeed, which is why I think a lot of us think just release the letter. There's nothing. Yeah. If there's nothing to hide, you might as well put it out there. I think the revealing thing in the whole of the Brexit debate this morning is that people are getting wildly excited about the fact that Greg Clark announced that Britain's negotiating position would be that we would like tariff-free trade with Europe. This is regarded as sort of some great insight into what this government is doing, and it says a great deal about how little we've been told, both in Parliament and in the media, about what they're up to, that this is somehow seen as a news story.
People excited that we're going for tariff-free trade?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
people are obviously easily excited these days.
The thing is, we don't know. This is where these things are at such a tentative phase. We don't know how the rest of the European Union is going to respond to Britain's negotiating hand. We know that Britain's negotiating hand is, could we have the best of everything, please?
Sure, well, that's only natural in a negotiation.
Well, as a starting point,
okay.
but that's not how it's going to end up.
Now we're getting wider than that. We'll have to see how the Nissan business unfolds.
I've been getting away with